Self-sabotage is not merely a reluctance to act or laziness. It is a deep internal conflict where our unconscious mind works against our conscious aspirations and goals. Often, this occurs at a level we are not aware of, but the mechanism is intricate and paradoxical. It can be hidden behind habits or even unexpected actions that seem logical or justified at first glance. As a result, we ourselves undermine what would seem to improve our lives, and then stand in bewilderment as to why we do not achieve the desired results. When you strive for health, personal development, or success, and suddenly at some point, you start to deviate from the path, this may be related to your shadow, those parts of your personality that you have either suppressed, avoided, or not developed. Jung emphasized that these parts of yourself do not disappear. They continue to influence our behavior, even if we are not aware of their presence. For example, if your life has been full of stress and overload, your shadow may manifest through the avoidance of successful and healthy habits, because for your unconscious. The text is incomplete at this point. Jung explained that recognizing the shadow is not simply accepting the dark sides of your personality, but a process of integrating these aspects into a more complete and harmonious self. Self-sabotage is one of the ways through which the unconscious attempts to maintain balance. It is a protective reaction, albeit not always constructive, that arises from internal conflict or fear. Interestingly, self-sabotage is often associated with our fears of success or change. We may fear that upon achieving something significant, we will lose something important, comfort, familiar patterns of behavior, or even the status quo. These are all subconscious mechanisms that protect us from what is perceived as a threat, even if, on a conscious level, we want change and growth. Jung said that only through awareness of these hidden patterns and acceptance of them can one achieve integration, a state when all parts of oneself work together, not against each other. The path to wholeness is not always easy, but it is possible if we learn to recognize the hidden motives of our behavior and not only their visible manifestations. Acknowledging our shadow and working with it opens up space for real change, where we can truly become who we aspire to be without internal conflicts and sabotage. Self-sabotage is not the final point, but a signal that somewhere inside us, there are unresolved issues that require attention. Instead of fighting it, understanding what lies behind this behavior is the first step toward internal transformation, and a life that not only corresponds to our goals, but also harmonizes with our inner needs. Self-sabotage is not just a moment of weakness or laziness. It is a much more complex and profound process, at the heart of which lie unconscious forces that act against our conscious desires. Jung, exploring this topic, asserted that self-sabotage is not a coincidence, but a recurring pattern of behavior where we predictably undermine our efforts at critical moments. In everyday life, this can manifest in various forms, from procrastination, when important tasks are postponed, to toxic habits, such as self-medication with food or substances, which, however, in the long term, only exacerbate the problem. Self-sabotage can even affect relationships, when we find ways to push away those who are important to us, or destroy our professional prospects, when we start avoiding opportunities or creating unnecessary conflicts. But why does this happen? Why, despite our awareness, do we continue to undermine our own successes? Jung found the answer in the concept of the shadow, those aspects of personality that we have rejected, suppressed, or never developed. From a very early age, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable in the eyes of others and which should be hidden. Perhaps in your family, emotions or ambitious intentions were not welcomed, and you learned to suppress these feelings in order to be normal, but suppressed aspects of personality do not disappear. They continue to exist in the shadow and begin to influence our behavior, even if we are not aware of their presence. These rejected traits can be both negative and positive. After all, the shadow holds not only our dark sides, but also unfulfilled talents and creative impulses. And if we do not recognize and integrate our shadow, it manifests through self-sabotage. For example, if we have suppressed our anger, it may return in the form of passive aggression or mysterious exhaustion in relationships. If we have rejected our ambitions, we may unconsciously sabotage the success of others. These behaviors, seemingly illogical, are in fact manifestations of unresolved internal conflicts based on childhood experiences and childhood wounds. Here, it is important to note that the shadow manifests not only in personal actions, but also in how we perceive other people. Often, those who cause us the greatest irritation are carriers of our own unrecognized shadow. Paying attention to our emotional reactions to others can lead to understanding ourselves. This is not simply a psychological game, but a real path to self-knowledge. When we see in another person something that angers or worries us, this may be a signal that we have rejected or not accepted it in ourselves. The connection between the shadow and self-sabotage becomes even more obvious when we consider what Jung called complexes, emotionally charged groups of thoughts and feelings that can be triggered by specific situations. For example, if in childhood you experienced emotional rejection, you may unconsciously create situations where you repeatedly subject yourself to pain, trying to resolve this experience. These are not mechanisms created by magic, but patterns rooted in the past. Similarly, parental complexes work. If, for example, your father was very critical, you may develop a cruel inner critic within yourself who will sabotage your achievements and undermine your self-confidence. Or, if your mother was emotionally unavailable, you may find it difficult to accept care, despite the fact that it is offered to you. What makes self-sabotage so persistent and difficult to overcome is that initially, it was a necessary survival mechanism. When a child learned to hide their feelings in order to avoid rejection or punishment, they did so in the context of their environment to ensure their safety. The problem arises when these surviving strategies continue to operate even in adulthood, despite the fact that they no longer serve their purpose and, on the contrary, begin to destroy the things that we now consciously strive to achieve. Jung said that, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And while this sounds like an inspiring statement, it requires the acknowledgement that our past continues to influence our present, and that without working with this influence, we cannot truly change. Jung saw the psyche as a self-regulating system striving for balance. Self-sabotage is not simply an accident or psychological dysfunction, but a process that has its role in maintaining internal balance. When one aspect of our personality becomes too dominant, the psyche seeks a way to compensate for this. For example, a workaholic may suddenly feel the desire to abandon all obligations, not because they have become lazy, but because their psyche requires balance that it is ignoring. Self-sabotage may also be a protection against ego inflation, when we too strongly identify ourselves with success, work, or even a certain social role. The shadow then acts as a reminder that our personality consists not only of those parts that we are proud of, but also of those that we avoid. Jung also spoke of the principle of enantiodromia, which means that the stronger we suppress some aspect of our personality, the more powerfully it begins to manifest in life. This behavior can be viewed as a form of self-defense by the psyche, striving for harmony, even if it is necessary to create certain psychological quirks for this. Self-sabotage, in this way, does not simply prevent us from moving forward. It can become a signal from a part of the personality that can no longer be ignored. It serves as a reminder that it is necessary to integrate rejected or suppressed aspects of oneself in order to proceed on the path of self-realization and psychological growth. This leads us to the concept of individuation, which for Jung was the basis of personal development. Individuation is the process in which a person strives to become whole, integrating all their sides. And here a paradox arises. We consciously strive for development and growth, but unconscious parts of us may fear the changes that this development requires. The psyche, protecting us from the pain of change, may begin to sabotage our efforts because true growth requires abandoning old, limiting patterns that, although they may be painful, give a sense of security. After all, any significant change is a kind of death of the old I, and the ego often resists this process. Jung said that the scariest thing for a person is to accept themselves completely. It is precisely this fear that we will not be able to cope with who we really are that often underlies sabotage. We fear the unknown and therefore continue to restrain ourselves, avoiding what could actually lead us to greater wholeness. Our ego may fear these changes and resist them, even if they lead to something better. Understanding your patterns of self-sabotage is an important step on the path to change. As Jung noted, our dreams give us a key to what is hidden within us. Recurring themes such as persecution or a feeling of dissatisfaction can be manifestations of self-sabotage. Important tools for working with the shadow can also be active methods, such as active imagination, in which we enter into dialogue with different parts of ourselves. You can try to imagine self-sabotage as a character, ask it questions, and try to understand its motives and fears. For example, if your self-sabotage is related to insecurity in success, ask what this fear is trying to protect. What happens if I stop being afraid? These questions open the way to a deep understanding of oneself and to the integration of those parts of personality that were previously suppressed. When we begin to project the contents of the shadow, this manifests in sharp emotional reactions that seem too strong for the situation, or in recurring conflicts with certain types of people. We begin to criticize those who possess qualities that we ourselves do not accept or reject in ourselves. Such patterns are quite characteristic, and often they become especially noticeable at moments when something begins to get out of control. Think about what in your life always goes wrong at certain moments, when you feel that something is stuck and familiar methods do not work. Often the answers to these questions lie in our shadow, in those aspects of personality that we avoid or suppress. An important part of working with the shadow is honest self-reflection. One must be willing to admit that many of our reactions may be directed not only at people, but also at parts of ourselves that we are trying to hide. For example, what are you hiding? What traits, which you possibly do not like, do you usually bury? What qualities do we see with irritation in other people, forgetting that this is our own unconscious projection? If you start to analyze which qualities in others you can see, it is often the same traits that we suppressed in ourselves. This could be rigidity, ambition, rudeness, excessive emotionality, everything that did not correspond to our perception of ourselves, to what could be demonstrated in our environment. Jung suggested several ways to work with the shadow, and each of them helps not simply suppress it, but consciously interact with it. Recognizing the shadow is not eliminating unpleasant qualities, but accepting them as an integral part of our I. When we begin to suppress certain traits, they simply go into the unconscious, where they continue to accumulate strength and ultimately come out in a distorted form. Suppressed anger can manifest as passive aggression or resentment, and if we avoid expressing our vulnerability, at some point it may break through in the form of despair and fall upon those who are close to us. Jung spoke of the importance of integrating the shadow. This is the process in which we consciously begin to accept these hidden parts of ourselves so that they do not destroy us and our lives. Dreams can become an excellent tool for this. If we begin to analyze our dreams, especially those in which bright, emotionally saturated characters or images appear that are the opposite of our usual self, this can be a direct indication of which aspects of the shadow remain unrecognized. In this context, Dream analysis is not simply decoding messages, but an act of interacting with those parts of us that we previously ignored or did not understand. Active imagination also helps us create a space for dialogue with these parts of ourselves. Imagine that you can talk to this hidden, rejected I. You can even draw it or write a dialogue with it. What does it want to tell you? What is under these actions that you usually perceive as undesirable or unpleasant? This can be a process of liberation from hidden fears or anxieties that previously remained in the shadows. A symbolic understanding of one's own self-sabotage can also be valuable. Instead of perceiving your destructive habits or moments of refusal as failures, we can view them as symbols trying to convey important information. Why do you put off things that seem important to you? Maybe this procrastination is a way to avoid unjustified expectations or a fear of success. Each such act of self-sabotage can reveal something important about our need for balance. Movement allows the unconscious to manifest itself in a more constructive form. In this process, we are not simply fighting the shadow, but learning to express it in safe, creative forms. It is important to give these feelings and impulses freedom, allowing them to find their way out in order to restore inner harmony. This is not so much a struggle as a journey into the depths of oneself, in which we find those parts that made us who we became. This is a process of realizing that all those qualities that we are trying to avoid or suppress can become a source of strength and growth if we learn to accept them and integrate them into our lives. Jung always emphasized that relationships with the unconscious cannot be one-time or short-term. It is a lengthy process, a dialogue that continues throughout life. In this dialogue between the ego and the shadow, it is important not to strive for a final solution or correction of the shadow, but for its integration. The very word integration does not imply the destruction or elimination of certain aspects of oneself, but on the contrary, their acceptance and understanding in their own context. The shadow is not an enemy, but an unrecognized part of our experience that we learn to understand and become aware of. Instead of rejecting one's aggression, wildness, or vulnerability, Jung taught how these qualities can be transformed into more constructive forms. Aggression can become healthy assertiveness, and vulnerability can become open, sincere communication. All these forces that we often try to hide or suppress are actually sources of strength and growth if we direct them correctly. Jung's theories have had a significant influence on modern approaches in psychology and personal development. These approaches view the psyche as consisting of many parts or subpersonalities, and this idea resonates with Jung's understanding of the importance of working with unconscious parts and not suppressing them. Likewise, methods of working with the shadow used by therapists such as Robert Johnson and Debbie Ford offer practical ways to integrate these shadow aspects into everyday life. Such methods help people accept and heal their protective parts, not fight them, which exactly corresponds to what Jung taught. Interestingly, in recent times, neuroscience has begun to confirm many of Jung's ideas. Studies related to adaptive unconsciousness, neuroplasticity, and implicit bias give us new evidence that unconscious processes indeed influence our lives and that their integration can lead to real change. This science shows that our ability to change is not limited only by conscious effort, but also by how we interact with our inner, often hidden, parts. The stories of people who have successfully integrated their shadow aspects share similar themes. They recognize their patterns of self-sabotage, then acknowledge their origin with warmth and compassion, perceive their protective role, and finally begin to find new ways to meet the needs that were previously met through self-sabotage. This process, as Jung says, requires accepting the paradox, not resolving it. There is the possibility of internal contradictions, simultaneously being vulnerable and strong, ambitious and compassionate, independent and connected. This tension of opposites is where real development happens. When we begin to live in these paradoxes, not trying to resolve them, we open the possibility for what Jung called the transcendent function, a new view of the world that connects, not excludes. Jung rightly noted that quick solutions and simplified approaches do not lead to long-term changes. When we try to simply get rid of unpleasant habits or patterns without understanding their deep purpose, they often return, changing form, but not essence. Genuine healing is not in eliminating shadow aspects, but in accepting them, in realizing their meaning, and in finding more constructive ways to express them. This process requires patience and willingness to see wisdom in our most complex and difficult aspects, in those parts of us that we would usually prefer to forget. As Jung said, wholeness is the acceptance of one's entire being. We cannot be whole by rejecting parts of ourselves. Only through accepting and integrating all of our aspects do we gain authentic strength and harmony. Jung viewed the process of self-knowledge as something much deeper and more multifaceted than simply finding answers or solutions. He called this path a heroic journey, which is a universal archetype found in myths and cultures around the world. This journey is associated with the need to meet oneself, especially with those parts of one's personality that we reject or ignore. Self-sabotage is not simply something that prevents us from moving forward, but an important meeting with our shadow aspects, with those parts that require acceptance and integration in order for us to move towards wholeness. In the Jungian tradition, one does not fight the shadow and does not try to get rid of it as an enemy. Instead, one learns to perceive it as an important part of one's essence, which, despite its dark nature, carries within itself energy and wisdom that can be useful on the path to wholeness. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of different parts of oneself. Individuation does not imply the absence of internal conflicts or contradictions. On the contrary, individuation allows us to live with these contradictions, perceiving them not as a threat, but as part of our multifaceted I. This is what psychological maturity is, not striving for an ideal or perfection, but the ability to recognize one's complexity and multifacetedness. In this context, any destructive aspects that are present in your life should not be viewed as something that needs to be gotten rid of, but as clues that show you the way to self-knowledge. These patterns can be protective reactions that are trying to express hidden aspects of personality or satisfy basic needs that have not been met. Thus, by entering into a dialogue with one's own shadow, as Jung said, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your heart. This requires courage to recognize and accept all parts of yourself, even those that may be uncomfortable or unpleasant. Jung, like other great thinkers, understood that the path to wholeness is not to eliminate one's problems or fight them, but to understand their roots. Otherwise, they will return in new forms, possibly even more confusing and destructive. However, if we learn to see hidden meanings and opportunities in self-sabotage and other complex patterns, and if we integrate these aspects into our lives, they can become sources of strength and insight. In this way, the path to wholeness is not the path to eliminating problems, but to becoming aware of them and transforming them. If you have discovered something valuable for yourself in this concept and want to learn more, I would recommend starting with Jung's book, Man and His Symbols. This is an excellent introduction to his views on the unconscious and the shadow. Robert Johnson E.'s introduction to working with the shadow in his book, Own Your Own Shadow, will also be useful. If you have noticed any patterns in your life or are experiencing responses to the proposed ideas, I would be happy to learn about your experience and hear how you work with self-sabotage and the shadow. Share your thoughts in the comments. This will help create a space for mutual understanding and support. And remember, as Jung taught, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. This process of choosing, accepting, And integrating your parts, including the shadow, is the path to becoming your true self.